just to kind of hit the due diligence piece, with a little bit more emphasis, I think Derek, had started this conversation, and Crystal highlighted in the last slide why diligence is important, because it can impact, final negotiations. And as Crystal said, to be able to really move the needle on sort of the basic deal terms that are agreed to by the business folks, that would be informed by diligence or something else that's happening that is sort of a large, unexpected thing, whether that's good or bad, right? More business, less business, whatever the case may be. The other thing that I will just mention that we don't have on this slide is, Crystal highlighted how long the process typically will take on average, and for, someone who hasn't been through the process before to be prepared for that. The other thing I will say is that in particular, the seller, be prepared for diligence to be very detailed, very intensive. Sometimes it feels very much, it can feel very aggressive or adversarial. And in most instances, it is not. But it is what the buyer, the buyer set and the buyer's team sets out to make sure that if they are going to pay a particular purchase price, that they are in fact paying for what they believe the business to be. So it can get very uncomfortable, and we certainly see clients that experience deal fatigue. So be ready for that when you're going through the diligence process. And, I touched on this a little bit. I think we've all touched on this a few times when we've been talking about diligence, but financial matters are going to be sort of the first thing out of the gate, because what is the business, right? What are the finances of the business? So that's often going to be the first piece of diligence, and that can be very in-depth on the finance side. Once you get through that, then you're going to start looking at operational items, compliance items, compliance, regulatory, licensure are going to be critical. It's important to understand the clinical competency of the team, the reputation, the business reputation. Payer relationships, payer contracts are all going to be critical. The relationship with referral sources, that's important on two fronts. One is the business side, who are, sort of the key clients and referral sources of an organization, and needing to know, are those relationships really rock solid is part of diligence, but also from the regulatory standpoint, if those relationships are rock solid, sort of pressure testing, why are they rock solid, making sure that, whatever is happening between the lab and the referral sources, doesn't have sort of any hair on it with respect to, fraud and abuse concerns, anything of that nature. So that's also part of the compliance side, but part of the operational side. Understanding if there has been any litigation on any front, not just, compliance or regulatory related, but any litigation, employment litigation, anything of that nature. Are there payer audits or payer investigations that are outstanding? Have there been recent repayments? If so, is it easy to explain why those repayments have taken place? Or, is there a reason that something had changed? Is it resolved? Is it ongoing? Those are all going to be part of, the diligence process. Looking through the organizational documents, are those key governance documents that are, critical to the organization, but sometimes feel like they're just a formality? Are those all in place? Are they well organized? Can they be produced for diligence? That's all important. Employment contracts, are they signed? Are they, in effect? Is anything not as it sort of seems at first blush? Third-party restrictive covenants, is there anything that's going to impact the business that nobody's really thinking about that's buried in an existing contractual agreement? And then Crystal had mentioned before, third-party required approvals. Those, you want to find those right off the bat. Make sure that everybody knows how that might impact the time frame of the deal. So that's just a bit of an overview on due diligence. There are a couple areas that I wanted to drill down on and speak on quickly before I turn it back to Crystal. And I will say that we've touched on this a little bit, and Derek did a nice job of talking about it. But coding and billing compliance is going to be a big ticket item. And that's on a couple different, there's a couple different ways to look at that, right? Because a company may look very financially healthy. The lab may look really, really healthy, But if it turns out that the codes that are being billed, the medical necessity support isn't there, or the workflow process, there might be something that a payer, could recognize as a vulnerability, or there could be a recoupment that's never happened because the lab hasn't been audited. But if it was, it would really change um, sort of the financial picture. Or for example, if a buyer says, well, I understand why you were billing this, but when we do this, we're not going to bill it this way. Like, we disagree with that. That could also change the financial picture. So that is going to be a big part of potential due diligence in a transaction, which is why I think, Derek's recommendation that that's something that lab owners consider pre going to market. It's a really good idea because, it may mean that, you know, an audit may find something that needs to change, and it may mean that, like, market is not now, going to market is in a few years. But that may be very valuable as a decision between going right now with that versus, changing some things internally and then going out later. So that's really important to be aware of. And in many instances, in our experience, and Crystal could maybe speak to this even more in more detail than I can, but many buyers do perform a billing audit. It may not be crazy in depth or wildly comprehensive, but they're going to do some of that. They're going to take a look at that. So I think if you're considering going to market, it should be something that's on your radar. Um, Billing compliance, how things have been billed, are going to be more critical in an equity deal or a stock deal where the buyer is actually taking over the company, because obviously that's all going to go with the company. If a buyer is sort of buying the business, but it's fashioned as an asset deal and the entity is not going to be transferred to the ownership of the buyer, then it's less critical. But it's still important just to understand, what is this work and what is it worth and how is it being billed. So our recommendation certainly is that sellers want to do this before going to market. So consistent with what Derek was saying earlier. Two other places that, from a healthcare regulatory standpoint, are important to be aware of and thinking about in advance are marketing and sales arrangements. As I mentioned when I was just talking generally about due diligence, understanding the relationship with referral sources is going to be really critical to the business from an operational, a financial, and a regulatory standpoint. And what's important to note here is if you have a sales force, well, it doesn't have to be just this, but I think it's important to share that and a sales force that is not an employed sales force that is receiving compensation on a variable basis is a potential target of the government, because really what we've seen over maybe the last 5 to 7 years is that and this is even, I will say that it has evolved with ECRA, but it was even for facts and arrangements that existed pre-ECRA, we are seeing the government look at those variable comp arrangements with independent sales reps as potentially being an anti-kickback issue. So it's really important to be aware of how is your sales team and structured, how are they compensated, what is the marketing, plan that they are carrying out on a regular basis, because that's going to be important. Even just generally, if you're not planning to go to market, that's really important to make sure that you have that in order. But certainly if you're going into a transaction, and again, I don't want to be too repetitive, but relationships with referral sources really goes hand in hand with the marketing and sales arrangements. And it really is also critical to the compliance side and also potentially sort of the financial assessment of the business and of the deal.